Hi, I'm Mike Shea from slyflourish.com and twitter.com/slyflourish, and I'm the author of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. This is the fifth video in an 8-part series covering each of the 8 steps for game preparation described in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. Today we're going to talk about developing fantastic locations. I love fantastic locations. They're one of my favorite parts about D&D, and they're probably my favorite part about world building. I love to build interesting places for the characters to explore. And fantastic locations are really where we can bring that high imagination and the sense of wonder to our players when we're running our game. We can think of fantastic locations like the backdrops to scenes in a play. If our game is a series of scenes that take place, then the backdrop behind those scenes are the locations where they take place. And we have no limit on what those locations can be like. So we can always bring something interesting, hence the term fantastic, which I probably overuse quite a bit, but I don't care. We can always bring something interesting that we just kind of don't have in the real world. So fantastic locations are covered in Chapter 7 of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and we're just going to take a look through the chapter itself. So a fantastic location is a place. It's the backdrop behind it. And we build fantastic locations in our 8-step process, not by writing out a big, long thing. We don't need to deeply describe what we're talking about. In fact, you can do so with just a handful of words. And it starts with an interesting name. Examples we have here are the Hill of the Great Skull, or the Bridge of Teeth, or the Path of Screams. Each of the names should be interesting and evocative. And you're only using it to remind yourself. We're not talking about writing published material that you're going to sell or give to other DMs. We're talking about the notes you're putting together for yourself, which means as long as you know what's in your head and you can just jot down a reminder that clues you into what's in your head, you don't really need much more. So when I talk about Bridge of Teeth, I have one thing in my head. You have something else. What's in my head doesn't matter. When you're coming up with your location, you know what's in your head and you know how to define it. So don't worry about making it descriptive because you're not handing it to anyone else. You're using it for yourself. So that's the first part, is just have an interesting location. We're going to look at a whole bunch of examples, by the way. I'm going to steal some from another book that I wrote. The second thing we have are a bunch of interesting traits of this location. I call them aspects. I took the term aspect from the game Fate, the role-playing game Fate. And an aspect is just a trait, a notable feature of the location, something that the characters can notice, something the characters might be able to do something with, something that might have some kind of effect in the scene. There are these kind of small pieces of information that tell us something about it. And again, we're using these as a reminder to ourselves. A couple of examples that we have in here are the Hill of the Great Skull, huge saber-toothed bestial skull bursting out of the ground. That's pretty interesting. Sharp bone shards thrust up out of the earth. Okay, there's all these bones sticking up, and a circle of glyphs on the skull's forehead. Somebody put a circle of glyphs there. So that's interesting. I'll critique my own work here a little bit by saying that like the first aspect and the name of it are kind of the same. So ideally you would have another, a third trait that isn't sort of defining what the original trait was. Bridge of Broken Teeth, I think I did the same thing. Bridge of Broken Teeth, narrow bridge of bone, stretch spanning over a gorge, bones tied together with cracked and splitting leather and sinew, howling wind that sounds like moaning. So, there could be, or you could, I would add like maybe a clattering of bones that are hanging out from underneath. So that's all we need, right? We don't need to define this huge thing. We don't write paragraphs of text. Again, if you're writing an adventure, and I do this when I write adventures, if I'm writing an adventure for someone else, I need to define it better than that. I need to make sure that the images, that at least I'm giving enough information for the DM that's going to read it and use it to build an evocative location. But when I'm just putting notes down for my own game, I don't need much, right? I really don't need more than just a few words, just a few phrases stuck together. So that's really what a fantastic location looks like. So what makes them fantastic, right? And I think to me, there's a bunch of interesting questions we can ask ourselves, but there's a few ways to make something really fantastic that I like, and they're easy cheats. If you're having trouble figuring out what makes something cool, size, make it really big. Big is always cool. and age. It's really old. It's been around forever. It's got mold that's been there for 1,000 years. It's buried half in the rock. How did that airship get half buried in the rock? That means it's as old as the rock itself, right? That's an old airship. So big and old are a good one. Another one is like asking what it was before. You know, if you're in this is a good one for dungeons, right? If you're in a dungeon, what was the dungeon before the characters got there and explored it? And maybe even 2 or 3 levels. It used to be a torture chamber, then it became a hideout for a bunch of bandits, and now it's being used as a rat warren. You know, you can stack all these things on and then add all sorts of detail that sort of spell all that out. So how many of these do you need? Generally, if we go back to our idea that the game is set in scenes and that the scenes are like scenes in a play, we probably need 1 location for about every 45 minutes of gameplay. So if you're planning on running a game for about 4 hours, you probably want to have 5 or 6 locations. If you're running, I tend to run 3-hour games. So in a 3-hour game, 4 is usually enough for me. But I might do 5. Again, these aren't hard, they don't take a tremendous amount of work. These are also a really great way to quickly build a dungeon. So if you have a place where the characters are going to explore a whole series of rooms, you can kind of take each chamber and make it its own fantastic location, or big ones anyway, right? And if you say like, they're going to explore a dungeon, I'm going to come up and for a 4-hour game in a dungeon, I might do 7. And the reason I'll do 7 is they don't have to hit all 7 of them, but I'm going to have like 7 big chambers. Each chamber has like a main name for it. It has a few aspects that that describe the chamber. And then I'll have connectors, like how are they connected together? So you can use the concept for fantastic locations for putting together dungeons quickly. So it's useful for that. I have a whole bunch. The book here, we have a whole bunch of different example ones. Crash planar vessel, a huge planar vessel. Hey, look, it's that one half buried in the rock. I remember that one. Blue fire burning eternally in the molten rock pits, and strange alien beings petrified in obsidian. Right. So that's pretty cool. 8, it's big, it's old, it's weird. There's 3 other tips. I heard this from Rodney Thompson, who was a 4th edition D&D developer. And he said that he got it from Chris Perkins, who is now the lead writer for D&D. And that's when you're looking at a location to keep it fantastic, familiar, and functional. So it needs to make sense. Like, if we think about a planar vessel, we can imagine what a ship looks like. And we know that a ship is something that you would soar around in. So, and then the fact that it's half buried in the rock and that's an airship, that's the fantastic element. So that idea of mixing those 3, they call them the 3 Fs, fantastic, functional, and familiar, that helps players understand what the thing is. What does this thing do? You imagine a giant gnomish clockwork device. So we know what a clock looks like. We can imagine a big mechanical clock. But then this one is huge in scope. So it's a great big thing and it moves around forever. And it's been measuring time since the beginning of the planet, and it's measuring it to the end of the planet. That's pretty fantastic. So it's got a function. It measures time almost to the end of the planet. It's fantastic because it's huge and old in scope, but it's familiar. We know what a clock looks like. So those are examples of where we can use the 3 Fs, the 3 Fs as they say. So I'm going to jump over to an older book that I wrote called, shockingly enough, Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations. So this is a book of 20 locations that I put together as improvisational material, as inspirational material for DMs. That isn't, they're not full adventures. They're places that you can put your place your game. We have all kinds of them. Like Dark Abbey is one of them. There's an old Dark Abbey, and again we sort of have these descriptions, and you can see here that like I added flavor text and I added longer descriptions, but we still have it. The mausoleums, right? The aspects: thick blood thorns, crumbling statues, poisonous moss, strange religious symbols. So I kept that same simplicity, but of course I spelled them out a bit more because I'm putting them in a book and I'm giving them to other people so that they can read it. But in this book, I have a chapter on building your own fantastic locations. Very similar to the chapter that you'd see in Return, but I have a whole bunch of different examples. So I wanted to use some of these older examples so that if you have Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, you can see some other examples from other material. Treacherous pathway, crumbling slick walkway and stone faces in the walls, the rainways, spiraling stone streets, gutters of continually flowing water, statues of ancient heroes, right? That's a good city one. The Queen's Fortress, a fortress hanging over the edge hanging over the edge of the cliff face. Water is flowing like hair over a carved female face, and eyes act as windows to the upper levels. So it's pretty interesting, kind of interesting stuff here. I think it's interesting. I wrote it. The deep tunnel, I'm skipping a few of these, but you get the idea. The deep tunnels, narrow tunnels dug deep into the mountainside, glowing gems that illuminate the passages, a network of vertical shafts carved out by a water flow. So yeah, all of these are quick and easy to put together. We don't spend a lot of time on them. So an interesting thing about fantastic locations is that we don't always need them. And particularly if we're running published adventures, many times the adventure has the material in it we need. So if you look at videos where I was preparing for my Tomb of Annihilation game, a lot of times I never bothered to define fantastic locations because there's already a bunch in the book. I'm just going to go with what's there. If they're going through the Tomb of the Nine Gods, every chamber there is crazy and has stuff. I don't need to figure that out. So that it shows sort of the advantage of a published adventure is that here's a step you can skip because you already have it. You paid for it. So you can steal fantastic locations. I wrote this whole book, The Fantastic Locations, so that it could be stolen and used. And there's no stories in here other than stories of their history. So the idea with this book was you should take it and take the ideas in it and add it to your own game. But you can do so from published adventures too. It's one of the great ways to get value out of a published adventure is to do that. And then there are other cases where you'll have a published adventure and you will, it's not very fantastic, right? Like you'll go to an adventure and there's like a sort of an old rundown building. Well, what makes the building interesting? Well, how about if there's this great big spire of black metal that pierced through the center of the building and that's what made it broken? It's like, where did that spire come from? And what is it made out of? And when did this happen? Like put something interesting in there. What if, instead of a big warehouse, here's one I did where I ran a game where there was a warehouse and it was like, well, it's got crates and barrels and stuff like that in it. But what if it had an enormous dragon skeleton in it? Like somebody had built a dragon skeleton in the middle of this warehouse. So, we can add, if an adventure doesn't add something that's interesting or doesn't really grab us, we can spend a little bit of time and come up with one. And all we need to do is say, what makes it fantastic? What makes this thing interesting? And come up with idea. And we get the ideas from all over. Look at movies, look at books, comic books, go absorb fantasy and in all of its forms, fantasy and science fiction in all of its forms, and figure out how to add that into the game to make some fantastic locations. So I hope this video is useful. This was the 5th of 8 videos. So you will see 3 more videos in which we go over the remaining steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. And hopefully this gives you a good idea of how to use these in your own game. So thank you very much.